Hey everybody, this is John for Pioneer Nexus MTG coming at you with another in-depth deck guide, this time with Rakdos Sacrifice. As a friendly reminder, if you do like informative modern content, please consider subscribing to the channel, give us a thumbs up, leave me a constructive comment down below, and let me know what deck you'd like to see covered next. So this is one of the trickier requests that we've had so far as deck coverage, because there's so many different flavors and so many different styles of this deck, and a lot of what they do hinges on what engine pieces you see out of the deck. So the first one that did well more recently, I believe at the NRG series, was covered by Devin O'Donnell, otherwise known as Doomwake, and his channel recently. It's one that I watched a little bit, and it's a little bit less engine based than some of the other versions we'll take a look at, but I thought it was interesting because it brought back Nixilis the Adversary as a very powerful engine to go with the rest of the Sacrifice. For those of you that don't know, the Sacrifice engine is more of a engine deck rather than individual pieces, whereas Rakdos midrange that we covered earlier is more of a good stuff deck. This is more of an engine deck based around cards like Witch's Oven, Village Rites, and Deadly Dispute, sacking expendable pieces and kind of take advantage of those sacrifices. One of the key pieces to this is Mayhem Devil, which whenever a player sacrifices a permanent, Mayhem Devil deals 1 damage to any target. Now this is both players. That is, if your opponent's sacking treasures, if they're sacking blood tokens, if they're sacking anything themselves, this also triggers on those. This also triggers notably on something like Croxus sacrificing itself if you don't happen to be escaping it. This is a card that can spray around and do a lot of damage very quickly and is a must-kill threat as far as the creatures in this deck. The rest of the creatures in this deck oftentimes just aren't kill on sight. Voldaren Epicure is a two-part sacrifice thing with both the blood token and the creature itself. You have copies of Unlucky Witness in this particular build that whenever it dies, exile the top 2 cards of your library until your next end step. You may play one of those cards. And then beyond that, you have Cauldron Familiar, which every time you see a Witch's Oven, you're generally seeing Cauldron Familiar, which, those of you who don't know how this combo works, basically the oven sacks the cat to create a food token, the food token gets sacked to bring the cat back, and it's just kind of this endless loop that really becomes annoying and pings for 1 life loss as it comes in. And if you have Mayhem Devil the Festivities, it really does a lot of damage over time. Beyond that, you have some fatal pushes to deal with your opponent's creatures. This is one of the best decks in the format, enabling fatal push revolt because of all the various different things you have sacrificing. And then copies of Claim the Firstborn to gain control of target creature when the mana value 3 or less until end of turn. Tap that creature, gains haste until end of turn. Oftentimes you'll want to steal your opponent's valuable creature, attack with it, and then turn around and sacrifice it to one of your various sacrificing effects. As I mentioned, one of the big things with this version is Nixilis. Now, Nixilis is not particularly good against decks that are going wide with boards and such. However, this deck typically does a very good job of keeping creature decks down a little bit, so this is kind of a nice hedge against control and other mid-range decks, which become more of a resource battle, and they become picking apart your engines quite well, especially in the post-board games. So kind of have a 4 of in your main deck of cards they have to respect. And, a notable thing is whenever you cast a Nixilis, if you have a creature in play, you may choose to sacrifice it and get a copy that comes in with that much loyalty, and it's not legendary. So you can have 2, 3, 4 copies of Nixilis running around. And then it's +1, each opponent loses 2 life unless they discard a card. If you control a demon or devil, you gain 2 life. It's -2, it creates a 1/1 devil, which triggers its +1 ability. And whenever this creature dies, deals 1 damage to any target. You also have the ability with Mayhem Devil to actually have other devils in play. And it's -7 as target player draws 7 cards and loses 7 life. So, nice way to either draw a bunch of cards or finish your opponent off after you've done some chipping away at the damage. And this build is very much built towards having kind of a pre-boarded against the mid-range and control decks, which are typically one of this deck's kind of worst matchups. As far as the mana base, you get to play Den of the Bugbears, you get to play Hive of the Eye Tyrant, just these powerful man lands. You get to play Crucible of Defiance as another way to get some cheap creatures. You get some Takenuma to kind of recur your threats, and then obviously you get to play Urborg, along with a bunch of dual lands to be able to cast your spells, as you are quite color intensive. Overall, main deck, very powerful for what it's up to do, which is beat creature decks, and can have a reasonable aggression plan against mid-range and control decks. Gets to play Gigantha as a companion, which is quite nice, and then you start getting into cards like Noxious Grasp, which come in against anything that's playing green or white creatures or planeswalkers, so very good against blue-white control when a lot of your other removal spells are pretty dead. Being able to kill Teferi and such, also quite good against mono green, which can be a tricky matchup if you don't get them. Don't stop their mana production in the early turns with like claiming the firstborn and then sacking their elves, etc. Damping Sphere, very important against decks like Lotus Field and Nykthos. Soulguide Lantern for opposing graveyard strategies, whether you're up against the decks like Greasefang or you're against kind of pseudo mirror matches. Another Claim the Firstborn for other small creature decks. Thoughtseize and Duress for any type of mid-range and control decks. And the final copy of Fatal Push when you need a little bit more interaction for creature decks. Let's take a look at some of the other builds, as there are quite a few unique builds of this deck. This one is a little bit more engine-based than the previous one. It's skewing things like Nixilis for some of the other stuff. And it's a little bit more maybe aggressive-based, as this features the other kind of core feature of a lot of these Rakdos Sac decks, and that is Oni-Cult Anvil. Whenever one or more artifacts you control leave the battlefield during your turn, create a 1/1 colorless artifact token. This ability only triggers once each turn. You can tap it to sacrifice an artifact. Oni-Cult Anvil deals 1 damage to each opponent, gain 1 life. This kind of becomes a self-perpetuating thing if you leave your 1/1 token alive. Basically, you can sack it each turn during your turn to deal them 1 damage, get another body, and if you get multiple of these in play, obviously you're getting multiple tokens, which can kind of spiral out of control. A lot of the other cards we've already kind of covered. Shrapnel Blast is a new one. As an additional cost, sacrifice an artifact, allow to deal 5 damage to any target. Obviously, Claim the Firstborn is kind of normal tech for these decks. And then the other card that's more of an engine card that you'll see in this version is Experimental Synthesizer. When it enters play or leaves the battlefield, exile a target card of your library until the end of turn. You may play that card. It's a nice way to get a little bit of card advantage while instantly having a artifact to sacrifice. Then 2 in a red, sacrifice to create a 2/2 Samurai token with Vigilance, activate only as a sorcery. So basically you have this fodder piece that you can sacrifice twice, potentially get 2 cards out of if you happen to hit well off the top of your deck. Make sure you play this or sacrifice it before you play your land for the turn in case you hit a land, etc. And then obviously Cat Oven, rest of the deck is pretty similar to what we already seen. 22 lands, this one plays 1 castle locked away to have a little bit of a grindy thing, as opposed to, still running 2 Den the Bugbear and 2 Hive Tyrant. So, once again, 2 color mana bases, you can get away with running some amount of utility. As far as the sideboard, this one's a little bit different than the tools. It's a little bit heavier on Graveyard Hate. Unlicensed Thirst obviously is both a threat and a way to fight your opponent's graveyards. Lantern of the Lost is kind of a similar to Soulguide Lantern, just templated a little bit differently. The Braid gives you a little bit of flexibility with your removal spells, able to hit opposing artifacts such as Karn stuff, etc. Voltage Surge is an interesting one that is also in the main deck that I should mention. As an additional cost, you may sacrifice an artifact. It's either a shock or it deals 4 damage if you sacrifice a artifact instead. So it's much like Shrapnel Blast, takes advantage of all these extra artifacts you might have lying around from blood tokens, from your synthesizers, from your Oni-Cult Anvils, etc. Claim the Firstborn, obviously very good against smaller creature decks. Thoughtseize and Duress against mid-range and control decks, kind of disrupting what your opponent's doing. Or if you suspect your opponent's like some type of combo deck like Lotus Field, these are decent cards to bring in, as well as ways to disrupt hate cards that you might run into that we'll talk about in a little bit. This one's a little bit different with how it's set up. There are no Nixilis in this one, and it's playing some other cards. You get to see obviously Cauldron, Familiar, Witch's Oven, etc., Oni-Cult Anvil, Deadly Dispute, and I guess we really didn't cover Deadly Dispute and Village Rites, other than to mention that they are sacrifice outlets for all this stuff going on. Deadly Dispute is important because it allows you to draw 2 cards and obviously create a treasure token, but you can sacrifice either a creature or an artifact, whereas Village Rites is 1 black, sacrifice creature, draw 2 cards. So both these are important for filtering through the deck, hitting your land drops, getting all your different engine pieces going. I didn't want to kind of gloss over them, as I did mention they are sacrifice outlets, but they also draw you cards at the cost thing, allow you to blank removal, etc. Especially if your opponent have exile-based removal for your cat and stuff, and you don't happen to have an oven. Quite a nice thing to have access to. Main deck, we've talked about most of these cards. One additional card is Blood Tithe Harvester, something you see more typically out of the Rakdos midrange deck, as it's kind of a removal spell with blood token attached. Whenever it comes into play, you get a blood token, and it's a 3/2 creature. You can sacrifice Blood Tithe Harvester to get target creature gets -X/-X, where X is the number of blood tokens. You don't have a ton of ways to create blood tokens, but you do have copies of Epicure and Blood Tithe Harvester, so you can kill some creatures with this. Meat Hook Harvest, or Meat Hook Massacre. Whenever it comes into play, each creature gets -X/-X. Whenever a creature you control dies, each opponent loses 1 life. Whenever a creature an opponent control dies, you gain 1 life. This serves nicely with your cat oven to increase the clock as far as your opponent losing life. Obviously pairs nicely with Mayhem Devil to ping down your opponent. Then finally you have 4 copies of Karn the Great Creator, which comes with the Karn Wish board. This is a nice way to shut down opposing sacrifice decks, as it shuts off their anvils, shuts off their witches' ovens, shuts off the equipment on things like Greasefang's vehicles. It's a very nice utility card, and is definitely a different way to build the deck. Obviously, you have this Wish package, you have a Bolas' Citadel for kind of mid-range matchups or just trying to overwhelm your opponent. You have Boat for creature matchups, you have Damping Sphere for various different things like Lotus Field and such. You have Oni-Cult Anvil, which is obviously a key of the deck, Witch's Oven, which is obviously a key of the deck, Pithing Needle, shut down Planeswalkers and such. Implement of Combustion, whenever it is put into a sacrifice it to deal 1 damage to target player or planeswalker, and when it's put into a graveyard, draw a card. So it's an interesting way to deal with various different things, get an extra card, etc. So it's a way to kind of keep the engine rolling. Bolt Surge we've already kind of covered, Thoughtseize we've already covered. Tormod's Crypt is quite a nice graveyard hate card with your Karn, and then Treasure Vault allows you to have a artifact land to fetch out with your Karn as you're doing wishes and you need to hit a little bit more mana, as these decks can be quite mana hungry between the man lands and Meat Hook Massacres and such. So I thought that was quite interesting. And yet another final way to build this deck is obviously very similar to a lot of the decks we've already seen. Your Cauldron Familiars, Deadly Disputes, Oni-Cult Anvil, some copies of Nixilis, some copies of Mayhem Devil. And the main deck is very much what we've already seen. The sideboard is where things get a little bit cute. So, we already covered Volt Surge, Duress, Curse of Shaken Faith. This is whenever an enchanted creature casts a spell, then the first spell they cast each turn, Curse of Shaken Faith deals 2 damage to them. Relevant against, other combo decks, whether it be Lotus Field and such, as they often have to cast several spells to win. Helps you kind of close out those matchups. Also relevant against, decks like Burn and such that might want to play more than 1 spell. Although it's primarily here for the combo decks, you certainly can find other applications for it. Kroxa and Graveyard Trespasser, while they don't sidestep some of the hate you might run into that we'll talk about, it does allow you to kind of transform, remove some of your engine pieces to actually become this kind of pseudo mid-range deck. Post-board games becoming much more akin to the Rakdos mid-range deck that we've already talked about. Then Go Blank, yet another card you can bring in against the mid-range and control matchups. You can just kind of play the grindier game plan that you might have to implement if your opponent is able to disrupt your combo pieces, etc. So as far as how to play the deck, this deck is very good against creature-based decks. You're able to steal your opponent's creatures, chunk your opponent's creatures, shoot them down with Fatal Pushes, shoot them down with Mayhem Devils. Now, certain decks can overpower them. Some of the Collected Company decks can, especially the Humans decks, can sometimes get their creatures too big. And then, problems if they have a way of sequencing things correctly, dealing with your Mayhem Devils with, Reflector Mages and Skyclave Apparitions and such. But overall, this deck tends to be generally very good against heavy creature-based decks, especially aggro-based decks like Burn, Mono-Red Aggro, Tribal decks. To a certain extent Mono-Green, although Mono-Green does have some tools against it. So this deck is very good against the aggressive creature-based decks, Spirits, etc. It tends to go fairly decently toe-to-toe with other mid-range decks. You know, you're able to play this grinding game plan, especially in game number 1. But they do have a lot of tools they can bring in against you, and oftentimes their individual card quality is better. So whether you're up against Rakdos midrange or like something like 5-color Niv, you can often find yourself outgunned in the midrange battle. And then control matchups, you find yourself very much in the aggressive posture. And while you can grind out some games, you know, with like Cat Oven and such, you know, oftentimes blue-white control or some of the other decks are going to find ways to deal with your engine pieces. And if they find ways to deal with your engine pieces, you're in a lot of trouble. And then combo, a lot of it comes down to you need disruption plus pressure. Game number 1, you're probably pretty badly positioned against a lot of the combo decks, unless they happen to be creature-based like Greasefang. You may be able to hold up a Fatal Push or something. But something like Lotus Field combo, sometimes your fastest aggressive draws aren't good enough unless you're running a Shrapnel Blast engine. You're oftentimes not fast enough, and then you kind of have to rely on your disruption plus pressure to win the games. As far as cards that can dent what this deck is doing, obviously anything that can take out the engine cards. Oni-Cult Anvil, Witch's Oven, Mayhem Devil being the biggest, you know, as far as the engines of the deck rolling. You know, so Artifact Hate, you know, out of mono white, out of blue-white control, you have things like March. You have things like Kolaghan's Command out of Rakdos. Cards like Abrade, which can deal with creatures and artifacts. You know, you can keep your opponent's engine from getting going, then they oftentimes have a hard time hanging in the game, as this is very much a synergistic based deck. Alternatively, you can kind of go over the top of what your opponent's doing. You know, something like blue-white control, especially in game number 1, you have cards like Fatal Pushes, you have cards like Claim the Firstborn. You know, all these are very bad cards against blue-white control. Now, obviously, things like Nixilis and discard spells help in those post-war games, so they do have game in those matchups, and they can certainly win, but blue-white control can be a very difficult matchup for this deck. 5-color Niv, I have not seen enough of it or played against it when I've done some practice stuff with this deck to know whether Niv's a good or bad matchup, but I would say a deck that's generally very over-the-top mid-range in nature. You know, lots of answers to different permanents, you know, whether it be Vanishing Verse, whether it be Abrupt Decay, whether it be if they're running Kolaghan's Command, you know, a deck that is inherently a 2-for-1 engine that goes a little bit bigger than what you're doing. Now, certainly you can eke out some wins, but, you know, that's another deck that can kind of attack what this deck is doing. The Rakdos mid-range deck itself, you know, oftentimes can take apart your key engines and it becomes an attrition game. So, you know, oftentimes being closer to the actual mid-range deck makes it a more interesting deck. I'm not really sure who's favored in that one, although I would say that is definitely a deck that can give problems. Decks like Lotus Field, you know, can certainly be a problem, simply because it basically ignores everything you're doing. And this deck doesn't have the fastest clock. Now, sure, it can kill on some draws with some of the builds on turn 4, turn 5, but Lotus Field is a very consistent combo, especially if they have Leyline, so I have a feeling that deck is not a great matchup for something like this. That said, other cards that you can bring in, specific cards that can attack this deck. The first one, if you're playing the cards green and white, Yasharn. Yasharn keeps things from being sacrificed, which gives a lot of problems to a deck that obviously wants to sacrifice things. Karn, the Great Creator. You know, this deck is very artifact-based, not being able to tap your anvils, not being able to tap your witches' ovens, you know, sacrifice your synthesizers, etc., all of which can be problems. I'm not saying you can't attack down a Karn, but if an opponent, like say Mono Green, is able to get a board down, protect their Karn, you know, and then grab a Graveyard Hate piece, you might be in some trouble. That said, Graveyard Hate, pretty good against what this deck's trying to do. You know, a lot of recursion and cats, you know, some of these builds having Croxa and such. You know, while it's not the be-all end-all, it does shut down that recurring annoying cat oven, especially if it's something simple like Rest in Peace that this deck can't deal with if it gets into play. Now, I've already kind of mentioned decks that kind of go over the top of what this deck is doing can really give it fits. You know, decks that, you know, blue-eye control, especially in game number 1, you know, and they have a lot of tools in the post-board games they can potentially bring in. 5-color Niv, another deck that can kind of go over the top of what you're doing. While it might not be the best positioned deck in the world in the overall meta, it's another deck that can go over the top of what they're doing. Lotus Field, another deck can kind of go over the top of what you're doing, other than discard spells, doesn't really care what you're doing terribly much, kind of does its thing and kills you. So, you know, as far as, you know, decks that decks that can fight this deck, generally with a mid-range deck, are looking for something that can go over the top of it. Mono green, I haven't seen enough of the matchup or played enough of the matchup to know one way or another. I do know they have some draws, like, Seven Carry it into, say, a quick Karn into, Graveyard Hate Piece. That might be enough in some games. Or Storm the Festival. Given enough time, it can overpower you. So, kind of going over the top is what you want to do with these mid-range decks. Or if you're not able to go over the top, you want to take apart their engines as quickly as possible. If you're a creature deck, you're in a lot of trouble. Not saying you can't win the matchup, or because if they have a poor draw, if they mulligan, all those kind of things. But it's a very difficult matchup. So, as far as red-black sacrifice, that's kind of what I've seen so far. Now, I'm not going to say in this deck guide that I've covered every single card that you can see. Unlike, say, a deck like mono red or a deck like mono blue, there's a lot of different ways to build this deck. Some of them are closer to the Rakdos mid-range version, some of them a little bit more engine-driven, some of them are kind of like that, the 4 of Nixilis version that we saw at the very beginning that aren't even playing Oni-Cult Anvil. So, there's a lot of things that fall under the red-black sacrifice umbrella. This deck is very powerful, but does have its weak points, as we've kind of pointed out here. So, that said, this is kind of my deep deck guide for Rakdos Sacrifice. As a friendly reminder, if you do like what you're seeing, please consider subscribing to the channel, give us a thumbs up, leave me a constructive comment down below. Don't forget to check out our other deck guides, which include things like mono blue, mono red, Lotus Field, Rakdos midrange, mono green devotion, Winota, which isn't relevant anymore, but yeah, already covered a lot of decks, and if you want to see another particular deck, please comment down below. This has been John from Pioneer Nexus MTG.